Hello, and welcome to Beyond Japan, an interdisciplinary podcast that looks at the broad reach of Japanese studies from within and beyond Japan. This podcast is brought to you by the Center for Japanese Studies at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, in collaboration with the University of East Anglia. I'm your host, Oliver Moxon, Project Support Officer at the Center for Japanese Studies and researcher of Japanese War Heritage. This week we are joined by Dr. Giulio Pugliese, Departmental Lecturer in Japanese Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford, who has written extensively on politics and international relations in the Asia-Pacific with a focus on Japan, China and the United States. Today we will be discussing the legacy of Shinzo Abe on Sino-Japanese relations following his resignation as Prime Minister on the 16th of September, and how his departure will impact the future relationship between Japan and China. We hope you enjoyed the show. Good morning, Giulio. Thank you for joining me today.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
I was wondering if you could start off by giving us a quick self-introduction, so explaining what your field is and what your research has been so far.
Sure. So I am a area study specialist by training, a Japan specialist. I've been living there. I lived there on and off 5 years altogether, and I am very much interested in contemporary politics, both domestic but mostly international, really. And I'm very interested in understanding the great power politics between Japan and China, but also by taking into account the role of the United States of America. And so you could say that I've been quietly expanding my research interests to include a study of Chinese and American foreign policy as well in recent years. And that's it. And I'm now based at the Nissan Institute for Japanese Studies in Oxford University. And I think that's enough bragging.
Great, sounds fascinating. So we're here today to talk about Sino-Japanese relations following the resignation of Shinzo Abe, the longest ruling prime minister in Japan at almost 8 years in total. He has been described by political commentators as a right-wing nationalist holding a revisionist view of Japan's Asia-Pacific war record, which includes denying the conflict war issue and something which has soured relations with South Korea. Has his premiership affected Japanese relations with China in a similar manner?
I'd say that by the sheer fact that we're talking about Abe Shinzo, the Grand Prince of Japanese nationalists, you could say, he has attracted a great deal of attention in both China and South Korea, especially as relationships with these countries soured. And so political machinations and partisan politics, I'm talking about South Korea, democratic country in this case, prevented the leadership of Park Geun-hye back then to get too cozy with Abe. And the same applies to China. When Abe rose back to power in December 2012, Japan and China were embroiled in the most important bilateral crisis since the normalization of diplomatic relations, and that was the crisis over the Senkaku Ryukyu Islands. And so it made perfect sense for the Chinese propaganda apparatus to also insist upon Abe's nationalism, because Abe is an almost operatic character, and in terms of his own personal views, they're frankly grotesque. They date back from his maternal grandfather, who used to be imprisoned after the Second World War to be indicted as a Class A war criminal responsible for crimes against peace. He was sitting in the war cabinet that waged the war against the United States of America as Minister of Munitions. And before that, he was a brilliant bureaucrat who was responsible for forced labor policies in occupied Manchuria. And Abe essentially inherited from his maternal grandfather this vision that Japan was an unrecognized, Imperial Japan was an unrecognized benefactor of Asian nations. It liberated them from the yoke of Western colonialism. I'm thinking more of Southeast Asia here, for instance. But more importantly, it actually sowed the seeds for change in terms of industrialization and a modern set of institutions that eventually, as the thinking goes, made possible for Japan's neighbors, especially South Korea, Taiwan, um, Hong Kong, and Singapore, to catch up and to modernize their own economies by climbing up the added value ladder. And people like Abe think that these countries have been in debt, especially South Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and Taiwan. And that debt is unrecognized. And so Abe eventually has this grudge that there is a constant quest for what he understands as apology diplomacy to keep down Japanese pride and Japanese pride in their own nation and the good things that the Japanese Empire also did. This is Abe's personal beliefs, but in terms of actual behavior, once he became prime minister, we should remind ourselves that Abe surrounded himself with foreign policy advisors that were sane, that were rational, pragmatic, and they basically advised against inflammatory behavior such as repeated visits to the Yasukuni Shrine. Only one happened in 2013. And they also advised against nationalist remarks of an inflammatory type. And so what happened is that, yes, the sheer fact that Abe was in power was also a big stumbling block for smoother relations between South Korea and China. But there were contextual political factors in these countries. In China's case, mostly geopolitical. In Korea's case, essentially domestic political, because the Japan issue with anti-Japan nationalism is a structural issue. It defines Korean identity, you might say. And these political issues prevented these countries from getting together with what they correctly understood as grotesque nationalist prime minister. But this is the person, this is Abe the person. Abe as a prime minister behaved in a different way. And so Abe opened up to another comfort women deal in 2015 with South Korea. And Abe also made a statement remembering the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War that did not provoke both South Korea and China. We're talking about ambiguous statements. Abe would still not walk the last mile to really showcase contrition for Imperial Japan that prevented him from being too inflammatory. And this, I think, is important to remember. And this is the answer to your question, I guess.
So to focus on Chinese-Japanese relations, what have been the major sticking points of Abe's premiership? You've written on the role of disputed territory, such as the Senkaku Islands, and an information war where tit-for-tat propaganda is put out in order to portray one as a benevolent power and the other as a hostile aggressor. Could you expand on this for us?
Sure. So I think that the major sticking point of Abe's premiership has certainly been the all-time low in South Korea-Japan relations since, again, the normalization of diplomatic relations, because there has been a race to the bottom, whereas the administration that followed Park Geun-hye essentially ignored the comfort women deal that was signed up by Abe and his equivalent Park Geun-hye back in 2015. And we've had a small escalation, whereas the Korean Supreme Court allowed for forced take of Japanese properties, of Japanese big business conglomerates' properties and assets in South Korea, because they did not repay and they were unwilling to repay forced labor during the time of Imperial Japan, especially during the war efforts. The Supreme Court's decision was essentially, in the eyes of the Japanese government, going against the letter of the Normalization Treaty that essentially settled the war reparations issue. And so the Japanese government feared that the Korean government was opening up a Pandora's box, not just in terms of possible compensation claims in South Korea, but also in the rest of Asia. And so it overreacted. And this, I think, comes from Abe Shinzo and the Prime Minister's office, that it overreacted in terms of enforcing export controls on important chemical products and components that should have been exported to South Korean powerhouses, business powerhouses producing electronic goods and whatnot. And this essentially further worsened bilateral relations. And so I think that Japan-South Korea relations, notwithstanding the full potential of the two important liberal democracies in the region that actually should have more or less common strategic interests, have these huge burdens of history and this huge identity, if you want, wall preventing them from building up a future-oriented relationship. And it takes two to tango, so as it's clear, I'm also blaming Japan. But I would say that with regard to Japan-China relations, yes, there has been a worsening of relations because China is the most important strategic challenge for Japan. And it has also taken the shape of propaganda on both sides, whereas as the Senkaku Diaoyu island dispute essentially saw Japan acting as a revisionist state, according to the Chinese, because it nationalized 3 of the islands, although Japan had possession of these islands essentially since 1895. And China's shipping and China's willingness to push the envelope by sending official vessels and aircraft and whatnot, and paramilitary vessels also, to the disputed waters and islands, that reinforced a sense of a grievance on the Japanese side. And so there has been this spiraling propaganda dilemma, you might say, whereas both countries insisted upon self-righteous portrayals of their own morally just claims over the islands and over the maritime claims of the waters surrounding the islands, and depicted the counterpart as a revisionist power bent on subverting the international order. And this is very dangerous. This is something that you clearly see right now playing up between the US and China. The US government has doubled down on the demonization of China, much more than Japan back during the high times of the Senkaku Diaoyu crisis. And I think that we are living in a world where we have to be more and more careful about government-led propaganda, not just from Russia, China, and what people like to call sharp power and disinformation and fake news, but also from our own politicians, from our own governments, and from our own allies, because it's a much more conflict-prone period that we're living in, where interests more readily clash. And so governments are more and more interested in pushing their own messages with domestic and foreign audiences in mind. So there is always a domestic audience in the back of policymakers' mind to sort of like amplify the self-righteousness of these messages.
When you say conflict prone, how bad do you envision these conflicts getting? Do you really believe this bluster and propaganda could actually lead to some sort of proxy conflict somewhere, or a direct conflict somewhere?
I think it's the opposite. It's the fact that interests conflict and the instability of the international system allows for a more aggressive and risk-prone behavior. That very behavior by different states, and the fact that the dust hasn't settled on many of Japan's and especially China's, of course, territorial and maritime disputes, and the fact that this kindles not just potential aggressiveness from the Chinese side, but also a defensiveness on other countries, a defensiveness that might actually lead to mistakes. And I'm thinking of Japan's nationalization of the islands in 2012. That was diplomatically a blunder, in my opinion, because it essentially allowed China to respond aggressively to that change of the status quo. And so you see that also the defensiveness on other countries' side may well lead to a conflict-prone situation. And once these conflicts get into, not necessarily full spirals, but gain traction, then it's at that very point that there is an insistence more and more on propaganda, on denouncing the counterpart as evil, as an existential threat. And this in turn reinforces mistrust. These signals reinforce mistrust and reinforce a spiral, not just in terms of a security dilemma spiral, where rearmament on both sides is seen as aggressive, and hence this is a self-fulfilling prophecy where both countries in a security dilemma imperil their own security by doubling down on military spending and whatnot. The same can be said about propaganda. By doubling down on aggrieved messages of my country right or wrong, and the counterpart is essentially pure evil, this may spiral out of control and actually widens the rifts. We're seeing this not just in the geopolitical realm, we are seeing it in the Brexit negotiations, or the failed Brexit negotiations. We're seeing a lot of nationalistic pandering that is really, it is worrisome. And I hope that the better angels of our minds and our souls will prevail. But that's my cynical situation, my cynical take as of now, my realist take, you might say.
To bring it back to the Asian Pacific theatre, as we pass the 75th anniversary of VJ Day, we're entering a world without living memory of the Asia Pacific War. In spite of the chronological distance, the war remains a flashpoint for relations between Japan and its neighboring nations. So do you predict any softening in this damaging discourse as the atrocities of Imperial Japan move further into the past?
So the standard take, the sort of orthodox, old-fashioned take on the historical issues was that as the old generation in Asia dies out, younger generations would essentially forget the brutal legacy of the Japanese Empire. But this clearly has not been the case. The nationalism and the remembrance of Japanese colonialism or Japanese wars of aggression and resistance to the Japanese have been enshrined in national education programs. In fact, you might say that they're not as relevant as other media, such as entertainment, movies, for instance. And if you look at the movies that have been produced in the past 10, 15 years, in China, South Korea, even Taiwan, you might say, you'll see a spike in the number of movies that distinctively have an anti-Japanese flair to it, historical movies. And this is interesting because it keeps up the flame of mistrust towards Japan, especially in South Korea and China. And I would say that it's a very tricky situation. As mentioned, in South Korea, anti-Japan nationalism is essentially it defines South Korean identity. It's one of the few issues that somehow gets the very split and partisan Korean society together, the conservatives and the progressives. It didn't used to be this way. And so it's going to be very, very tricky. Japan has apologized. This is often misunderstood. The Japanese government has apologized repeated times since the 1990s, especially, officially. But nationalists like Abe, who want to build a big Japan and whatnot, make Japan a proud, great power, are particularly aggrieved at the fact that Japan has to always atone for its past misdeeds, and it can't move forward. And for some good reasons too, because Japan, since the end of the Second World War, is not a militarist country that is back to expand its influence in the Asia Pacific. No matter the grotesque discourses that you sometimes hear in the news outlets of some of Japan's neighbors. And people like Abe think that the Vergangenheitsbewältigung, as the Germans call it, this kind of like introspective, almost pain and taboo that the Japanese citizens feel and still do feel a lot towards military means and towards military as a tool of statecraft, that essentially keeps Japan down from playing a more assertive role in international politics. Abe has called this essentially a masochistic education and has made sure that a patriotic education would move Japan forward as a normal country, essentially. And I understand where Abe comes from. I think that we are still seeing a very minimalistic Japan. Certainly, it's no big military spender in relative to GDP or in absolute terms compared to China. But relative to GDP is also another as much a military big spender as South Korea, where there is military conscription, for instance, not least because there is only just a truce between the North and the South. Japan is still a very anti-militarist country. We shouldn't forget this. And people have been suspicious of Abe's security reforms. That's not the reason why he has been the longest serving Japanese prime minister ever. He was basically able to buy off the electorate while the opposition was in shambles. But again, people are not enamored with Abe's security reforms and with Abe's security profile, to the extent that today the constitution hasn't been amended. And so I would say that it takes two to tango. I think that the Japanese government should be more forthcoming with regard to apologies and recognizing its brutal legacy. It would only do good. But I also understand that there will be a backlash within Japan's nationalist forces when this happens, and this eventually is going to divide the nation and whatnot. But I'm not sure that apologies are also going to be remembered and properly understood among Japan's neighbors as of now. We shouldn't forget that, again, Japan's track record has been fairly positive in terms of being a faithful upholder of international society. And since World War II, Japan's military has been super defensive. It hasn't sent troops abroad to fight against an enemy. It has sent engineers, it has sent military, its own military for peacekeeping operations, but it's been very different, for instance, even from the track record of South Korea that has sent 100,000 soldiers in Vietnam, for instance. And so we should be very careful when we think about, Japanese militarism and whatnot. It's very political. It's very, you might say, it hits a raw nerve in terms of the national identity of these very proud countries that even Hobsbawm described as proto-nations, China, Korea, the peninsula, and Japan. Even before the advent of modernity, they had a distinctive self-representation as a unique nation with a specific language. And this feeds into this tricky process of reconciliation, I think, precisely the fact that they are very proud.
Abe has been known for maintaining a close relationship with the United States, getting close to Trump as he alienated other world leaders. Some experts are suggesting that Trump won't be re-elected this November. So I was wondering, how do you view Sino-Japanese relations moving forward in the context of likely changes to the Sino-American relationship? And also, how will this impact regional developments where Sino-Japanese interests converge and compete?
I don't think that U.S. foreign policy towards China would drastically change under a Biden presidency. An anonymous Japanese government official published a commentary on the American interest early in 2020 by stating unmistakably that the Japanese government prefers Trump to Obama, and Biden was Obama's vice president. Because Trump, yes, he's unpredictable, he is in many ways unhinged. That's not his words, by the way, these are my words. But he has essentially reshuffled American foreign policy priorities by prioritizing China. China is essentially the key revisionist power and existential threat that needs to be addressed. This has been happening under the Donald Trump administration, as evident by the National Security Strategy of 2017 and the National Defense Strategy of 2018. And this has also been accompanied by what some people in Trump quarters call peace for strength. The military budget has increased to levels comparable to the Iraqi war. And this is essentially also meant a repositioning of American forces in the Asia Pacific. And Abe likes that because the Abe government has essentially developed Tokyo's China policy, which is essentially synonymous with Tokyo's foreign policy, because again, China is the most important and pressing security challenge for Japan in terms of negotiating from a position of strength. And the key vector that has allowed Japan to negotiate from a position of strength with Beijing has been the US-Japan alliance. A strengthened US-Japan alliance that had more and more guarantees of coming to the rescue of its ally in case of a contingency around the Senkakus, in case of a cyber attack and whatnot. This reassured Japan and conversely enhanced, in the eyes of the Japanese, also through major presence operations and showing military signaling and military exercises. This essentially has allowed the alliance to showcase deterrence towards the Chinese. And the Chinese government has, in fact, softened its own position vis-a-vis Japan precisely at the time when the US government pursued a more maximalist pushback against China. And so to open up spaces for its own strategic latitude, China made tactical overtures to India, to Japan, and this, in a sense, gives you a sense of how entangled are Japan-US relations with Japan-China relations. I don't think that Biden will, however, change things drastically. What will happen, in my opinion, is that there will be a reset with China in terms of tariffs. Maybe Biden will do without tariffs, even if he's from the Democratic Party. I'm not sure that tariffs play well into American prosperity, especially following a disastrous pandemic that has ravaged the American economy. There might be a reset on that front, and there might be a more inward-looking administration for obvious reason, that is dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic. An inward-looking administration that is more prone into healing its own wounds and spending its own resources for healthcare reform that is perhaps less ambitious than Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, but that may be in the cards, and other welfare measures that America will badly need. This will mean necessarily less military spending and perhaps needing to find a more cooperative posture with some of the international players. And China is one of them. And so to the extent that, yes, there is a bipartisan consensus against China's economic malpractice, assertiveness, aggressiveness, whatever you want to call it, its political involution and its almost neo-Stalinist political system, I see a Biden presidency as being certainly much more restrained than Trump's, but not changing the equation drastically. For one thing, human rights will be top of the agenda, and this is very different from a Trump presidency. And the China issue has been politicized big time in the US, and so Congress will certainly corner even, a panda-hugging Biden if that were going to be the case. And I think this will be also to the advantage of Japan. Japan has invested in a rethink of American foreign policy in terms of pushing for a more sort of clear-eyed and deterrence-prone China policy. And so I think that there won't be major changes, and not least because Suga is going to essentially push for the same foreign policy line that Abe has pushed for before.
Okay, I'd like to focus a bit more on Suga, as it's now guaranteed that he will be succeeding Abe as interim prime minister until the election in 2021. What do we know about him as a politician, and do you predict any changes in his rhetoric, if not policy?
Abe was enormously frustrated when he had to resign in 2007, nominally because of ulcerative colitis again. And he was enormously frustrated because his successor, designated by the LDP hastily, was Fukuda Yasuo, who basically scrapped all of Abe's reforms in foreign and security policy, which are Abe's pet projects. And so what happened this time is that Abe has learned from the past, as he did before, during the course of the term. He lasted 7 years this time rather than just 1 year. Abe learned from the past, and he essentially he essentially skillfully arranged for factions to fall in place to allow for a successor that will uphold his own foreign policy and policy castle. And that's his former chief cabinet secretary, Suga Yoshihide. I think that for this very reason, Suga is an atypical politician. He's not a hereditary politician. He comes from a humble socioeconomic background, and he has essentially strove to and worked hard to pursue a political career. Interestingly enough, without factional support, which is interesting, and without the connections and the legacy that comes in a good portion of former Japanese prime ministers. So we're talking really of an exceptional case in recent year in terms of his own personal background. But Suga is, in many ways, a domestic politics-focused politician. He's particularly good at tapping bureaucrats for his own policies. And he has been a smooth operator in terms of managing domestic politics for the sake of strengthening the LDP grip on power, both in terms of managing the relationship with the media, the news media, but also in terms of strategically devising key dates where strategically devising lower house dissolutions that would have allowed the LDP to declare general elections and then further strengthen their rule. I think this is what might happen before Suga's term as LDP president expires in September 2021. Before the term of the lower house, before the full legislature ends in October 2021, I think that we will get lower house elections sooner rather than later, because the economic situation the economic prospects are not fantastic, and we're going to get hit by a second wave of sorts, perhaps much more manageable than the first, because we know more or less what we're talking about when it comes to coronavirus and how to treat it and whatnot. But it will be tough. It will be tough for the economy, for one. And so it would make much more sense for Suga to steal the thunder and dissolve the lower house now that popularity rates are up. And with regards to policies, as things stand now, I would imagine that everything will keep more or less the same. Abenomics will continue. The free and open Indo-Pacific grand vision will certainly continue. It has recently been exported to Germany, meaning that Germany has enshrined the free and open Indo-Pacific as a key pillar of its own foreign policy. And we shouldn't forget that the free and open Indo-Pacific is a Japanese initiative originally, espoused from the US, but eventually snowballing into all sorts of countries adopting it. And even if it has different meanings depending on the country and whatnot. But it was Suga's executive secretary, when he was chief cabinet secretary, Suga's executive secretary back then, Ichikawa-san, was the creator of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, vision. And I imagine that precisely because of that link, he will probably tap on Ichikawa to expound on this concept, and I imagine that we would see a lot of continuity. One small discontinuity that I might see is that Suga may need to open up the country to foreign tourists, especially because of the Olympic Games. And Suga has been, one of his policy successes has been the booming of inbound foreign tourism into Japan. And I suspect that Suga may relax the sort of like pandemic sakoku for all the Japan experts that are listening. Basically, the Abe government during the pandemic has closed off the country, not unlike the Edo period when Japan more or less closed off itself, when the Tokugawa closed off the country from foreigners from accessing it. And so we would probably see steadily a resumption of allowing at the very least visa holders to enter the country. It's now not allowed for visa holders, even working visa holders, to enter Japan, which is it's a bizarre situation. But I imagine that given Suga's sympathies and the looming, I'm not sure whether it's the right word, Olympic Games, there might need to be an intake of foreign tourists and foreign workers and foreigners more generally.
I think we're all hoping for a change in tact in regards to that sometime soon. It's been reported by the BBC that Suga is a stand-in interim prime minister expected to keep Abe's course, as you've mentioned, and that a more energetic candidate will be proposed by the LDP for the next election. What rhetoric do you expect from an energetic LDP candidate towards China?
Well, I don't know. I think that an energetic LDP candidate has to strike a balance between drawing a red lines in terms of defining and signaling the willingness to protect Japanese interests. And this would be communicated and signaled not just to the Chinese audiences, but also to Japanese audiences and foreign audiences, because of course you have to communicate resolve also to your counterparts, not least the United States of America. But at the same time, it has to strike a balance between that message of resolve and the need to assuage Chinese counterparts, to save their face, because ultimately diplomacy has to prevail. Diplomatic property is in bad need nowadays, now that unfortunately, we are more and more surrounded by nationalistic discourses that are making us all much more stupid and taking us into a bad place. And so diplomatic property and diplomacy, even in times of crisis, is a resource that should be more and more often go back into fashion. It should go back into fashion. It should be more often taken into consideration. I think that Kono Taro would be an excellent prime minister in terms of foreign and security policy. His English is excellent. His upbringing is very international. And he has served both as a foreign minister and defense minister already. And he would be an excellent spokesperson for Japan. I think that Suga would simply delegate foreign and security policy to bureaucratic cadres, to bureaucratic brains, and to the current Minister of Foreign Affairs, who has been Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Motegi, already under the previous Abe cabinet, and so I see continuity essentially. That's my answer. But on the fact that Suga will be a caretaker that will be replaced, I don't think that that's necessarily the case. Suga will take a taste of power. Suga is taking a taste of power, and he might well dissolve the Diet before the opposition parties coalesce into a big one, and before the economic and COVID situation worsens. So my bets are still on early lower house dissolvement and general elections by the end of this year. And this means that if he wins them, then he will cement his position within the party vis-a-vis the factions and stay in power for at least 4 years or so, I would imagine.
So lots to watch for then in the coming years then. Finally, I'd like to just discuss, as you have already mentioned, Brexit. In light of the UK-Japan trade deal, does the UK have any role, however small, in Sino-Japanese relations given the UK's erratic approach to China?
Right. So Japan was very frustrated. We barely hear this in the public commentaries and news media. We like to think that Japan was following the United States when both countries decided not to join China's Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank in 2015, and they never did. The US and Japan are still not members of the AIIB. And Japan was very frustrated when the UK, Cameron and Osborne, decided to sprint off and announce their decision to join the AIIB. And it was frustrated out of its own grievances vis-a-vis China. It wasn't forced and pressured by the US. It was Japan that essentially was very displeased at China's new multilateral development bank, and with that, China's growing influence. And the UK-China relations back then was basically enthralled by the so-called golden era, but it basically has gone flat. Under May, we've seen already a kind of recalibration of UK's China policy, but now we've seen it more and more with Johnson, not least because of American pressure and because, of course, of backlash on the Hong Kong national security laws, and China's amateurish and self-centered, I would say, because it's just basically essentially domestically driven wolf warrior diplomacy. China's undiplomatic diplomacy hasn't won friends at all among foreign public opinion, especially during the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic, which originated in China, has just worsened and worsened this perception of China's intentions and China's the nature of a Chinese government. And so what we have seen is that there has been some convergence with Japanese interests in terms of being more suspicious of China, but also in willing to showcase a military presence in the Indo-Pacific and joint military exercises. The promise that a UK aircraft carrier would sail the South China Sea in the near future. These are all posturings by the UK to prove not just to Japan, but also to the United States of America, which has a very harsh now and critical view of China and has launched and developed a set of policies that aim at cornering China. Well, the UK is basically adapting a bit. We've seen this also with Huawei, although the UK is arguably still hedging. But anyway, I think that the stars are aligning in Japan's favor. But there's something else. I think that the UK government's foreign policy priorities are clearly in the trade and economic realm, because they are perfectly entangled with domestic political gains of taking back control, of showing to the British electorate that Britain will thrive after leaving the European Union by signing as many free trade agreements as possible with the outer world. And so, freed from the shackles and the impositions of Brussels, Britain will be free to sign up to trade deals and investment agreements with the rest of the world. And so, for that very reason, the UK has lobbied hard Japan to showcase results in terms of bilateral negotiations for a free trade agreement. And this was just announced, right? The negotiations for a free trade agreement between the UK and Japan have been successful.
Yep.
What we would see now, in all likelihood, is that the UK will push hard also in joining TPP, which is possible, provided that you get lobbying from within TPP by important countries such as Japan, Australia, and there are many Commonwealth countries, I would imagine, that would also want to see their economic relationship with the UK expanded. But there is something that I sense is playing up. What is Japan getting in return? In my opinion, and which has to do with your question on Sino-Japanese relations in China, my feeling, judging from the reports about Japan potentially joining the Five Eyes intelligence alliance. My feeling is that Japan has tried to secure and perhaps secured an additional voice in favor of the country joining the Five Eyes alliance, intelligence alliance network, and that is the UK. The US is very jealous of its own intelligence services. And as you might know, the Five Eyes Alliance is this intelligence alliance between the Anglophone countries of the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And as the US, the most important country and most powerful country of the five, as the US more harshly repositions its foreign policy to prioritize the China challenge, it badly needs also good intelligence. And the Japanese have very good signal intelligence, but also human intelligence because of cultural proximity with China, because the country has actually known China quite intimately. It has actually occupied China. And ethnically speaking, it's easier to basically develop links with China, also in terms of the sheer geographic proximity to Japan. And so there is an alluring proposition of letting Japan join the Five Eyes Alliance to share its own intelligence on China and North Korea. And in return, of course, Japan would get intelligence from the other countries as well. I suspect that the UK, this is all in mysterious. It's a mysterious world to me. So I'm just imagining things. But I suspect that the UK, since it badly needs economic deals and free trade deals and whatnot, the negotiation lever that the UK can play up with Japan is precisely its outstanding security role. Not just in terms of physical presence in the Indo-Pacific and cooperation with Japan on this and that infrastructure project and connectivity project, but also in terms of allowing Japan to get a share of the Five Eyes intelligence pie, and in return, it would get something else on the economic front. I would say that Australia, especially with this government, is clearly interested in having Japan joining, in my opinion. I don't think it's feasible. I don't think it will actually happen, but I think that perhaps this is one of the things and one of the chips that the UK might be using. And that might actually hint at a growing proximity between the two countries in a sense. Because joining the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance then doesn't necessarily mean that you will have to fight a war for that country. And so there are no fears of being entrapped into a Japanese war. But certainly there has to be a trust issue and deep down a trust issue also in terms of Japan's institutions being able to more fully and confidently show that they can protect the information that they receive from others and that they actually automatically get from others. But there's also deep down a mistrust that boils down to, Japan being other, Japan being ethnically different. And so I suspect that nothing will happen, but knowing how the UK has used its own security leverage to get economic concessions here and there, I would imagine that this might actually be happening, not least because we see signals that some countries are lobbying also for, and portions of countries in Australia and the UK are lobbying for Japan to join the alliance. And so I imagine that this may play well.
It's very intriguing. Thank you for all your comprehensive answers, Giulio. It's been a very insightful episode.
I'm happy that you liked it. Thank you for having me.
You can find Dr. Giulio Pugliese's research profile in the link below. You can read more on his research on Sino-Japanese relations in his 2017 text, Sino-Japanese Power Politics, Might, Money and Minds. Join us next week when we will be in discussion with Dr. Chris Perkins on Japanese-Korean culture exchange. Thank you for listening.